I was sitting in a hospital hallway at 11 o'clock at night, holding a paper cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking when an elderly nurse stopped in front of me, looked at my face for a long moment, and said very quietly, "You're not supposed to be here." I assumed at first that she meant the wing itself, that I'd wandered somewhere past visiting hours without realizing it. It took me almost 3 weeks to understand she'd meant something else entirely, something that would eventually unravel every story my family had ever told me about where I came from. My name is Helen. I was 51 years old the night that nurse spoke to me in a hallway on the third floor of St. Augustine's Medical Center. And by the time this story ends, you'll understand why a woman who had known me for exactly 4 seconds looked at my face like she was seeing a ghost. I need to explain why I was in that hospital in the first place, because the context matters more than it might seem to at first. My father, Robert Whitfield, has suffered a serious stroke 3 days earlier, and I'd been living out of that waiting room ever since. The way you do when a parent's condition keeps shifting between stable and uncertain, without ever fully committing to either. My mother, Diane, had gone home that particular night to sleep in an actual bed, insisting I do the same. And I told her I would, and then simply hadn't, because some part of me couldn't stand the thought of my father waking up disoriented with no one familiar nearby. I want to explain something about my family before I explain the nurse because the two things turned out eventually to be impossible to separate. I was adopted. This was never a secret in my family, exactly. Though it also wasn't something anyone discussed with much detail or warmth. My parents told me from as early as I can remember a version of the story that stayed remarkably consistent over 5 decades. My birth mother had died shortly after I was born. My birth father was never in the picture, and the Whitfields, a respectable, comfortable family with more than enough love and resources to spare, had adopted me through a private arrangement facilitated by a family friend who happened to work in hospital administration. It was, for most of my life, simply a fact about myself, delivered without much emotional weight, filed away the same way you file away the fact that you're allergic to shellfish or that you were born in October. I never pushed for more detail than that, partly because my parents' version of the story always carried a subtle undertone that further questions weren't particularly welcome, and partly, I think, because some quiet, self-protective part of me had decided long ago that digging into it wouldn't change anything. So there wasn't much point disturbing a story that had always kept me comfortably, uncomplicatedly loved. I want to be honest that uncomplicatedly loved isn't entirely accurate either. My parents loved me, I never doubted that exactly, but there was always a particular flavor to it, a formality, a sense that gratitude was somehow baked into the arrangement in a way it wouldn't have been for a biological child. My mother used to say things like, "We chose a you, Helen," which is more than most parents can say, in a tone that was clearly meant to be affectionate, and that I nonetheless spent most of my childhood quietly absorbing as something closer to a transaction than a bond. My older cousin Patricia, Diane's niece, once told me at a family gathering when I was 13, not unkindly, but not particularly kindly either, that I was lucky the Whitfields had taken me in, given where I probably would have ended up otherwise. I never forgot that sentence, even though I couldn't have told you, for most of my life, exactly why it bothered me as much as it did. There were other small moments too, scattered across 3 decades, that I trained myself not to dwell on individually, though looking back now, together, they formed a pattern I'd simply never allowed myself to see clearly. My mother kept a family photo album that began deliberately On the day I arrived at their house, nothing before it. No newspaper clippings, no paperwork, no photographs of the family friend she credited with arranging everything. When I asked, as a teenager, whether I could see any documentation from the adoption itself, she told me the records had been lost in a basement flood years earlier, an explanation I accepted without question at 17, and only started quietly doubting somewhere in my 30s when I noticed the rest of that same basement's paperwork, tax records, insurance documents remained perfectly intact going back decades. My father was gentler about the subject than my mother, though gentler. In his case, often just meant quieter. He used to tell me, on the rare occasions the topic came up, that the details didn't matter nearly as much as the outcome, that I was his daughter in every way that counted. Full stop, end of conversation. I believed him completely, and I still do, even now, even knowing everything I know. But belief in the outcome never quite managed to answer the questions underneath it. And those questions, it turned out, had simply been waiting patiently for over 50 years for someone else to finally ask them out loud. So when that nurse looked at my face in a hospital hallway and told me I wasn't supposed to be there, something about the specific wording of it, the certainty in her voice, snagged on the old, familiar discomfort in a way I couldn't immediately explain. She was gone before I could ask her what she meant, disappearing down the hallway with the brisk, purposeful walk of someone who'd said more than she'd intended to and knew it. I sat there for a long moment, coffee going cold in my hands, telling myself I'd misheard her, that exhaustion and stress were doing exactly what exhaustion and stress do to a person's judgment at 11 o'clock at night in a hospital hallway. I saw her again 2 nights later, restocking supplies in a small alcove near my father's room. Her name tag read Bernadette. She looked to be in her 70s, silver hair pulled back severely, the kind of nurse who clearly spent decades in a profession that had long since stripped away any patience for nonsense. And something in her expression, when she glanced up and saw me watching her, told me she'd been half expecting this conversation to happen eventually. "You said something to me the other night," I said, "in the hallway, that I wasn't supposed to be here." Bernadette set down the supplies she was holding very carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to accidentally drop. "I shouldn't have said that," she said. "I was tired. I misspoke." "You didn't misspeak," I said. "You looked at me like you recognized me from somewhere." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face again with the same unsettling intensity as before. And when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped low enough that I had to lean in slightly to hear her. "What's your birthday?" she asked. "And were you born here at St. Augustine's?" I told her. "October the 14th, 51 years earlier, and yes, at St. Augustine's, the same hospital where my father now lay recovering 3 floors above us." Bernadette closed her eyes briefly, the way you close your eyes when something you've been carrying for a very long time finally sets itself down. "I need you to come find me when your father's settled," she said. "Not here. Somewhere we can actually talk." There's something about that date I've never been able to stop thinking about, and I think, God help me, I think you might be the reason why. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting in the hallway replaying every version of my adoption story I'd ever been told, searching for the exact shape of whatever it was Bernadette clearly knew and I didn't. We met 4 days later, once my father had stabilized enough that I felt comfortable stepping away, at a small diner 2 blocks from the hospital that Bernadette said she'd been eating breakfast at, after every night shift for over 20 years. She was out of uniform, smaller somehow in street clothes, and she ordered coffee for both of us before I'd even sat down. the gesture of someone who clearly rehearsed this conversation in her head more than once. I worked labor and delivery at St. Augustine's for 34 years, she began. October the 14th, the year you mentioned I was on shift. I remember it specifically, and not because it was a particularly unusual delivery. I remember it because of what happened 3 days later. She told me about a young woman, 19 years old, unmarried, who'd given birth on that exact date, in that exact hospital, to a baby girl. The young woman's name, Bernadette said, was Rosemary Doyle, and she'd come from a family with almost no resources and no standing whatsoever in a town where the Whitfield name, my adoptive family's name, carried considerable weight. Rosemary held that baby for 2 days, Bernadette said. I remember because it's unusual, even now, for a baby destined for adoption to stay with the birth mother that long. Hospital policy at the time usually moved things along faster than that, but there was some kind of delay in the paperwork, and Rosemary got 2 full days with her daughter before anyone came to take the baby away. And then what happened? I asked, though some part of me had already started to understand where this was going, my hands wrapped tight enough around my coffee cup that my knuckles had gone pale. She was told on the 3rd day that the baby had died overnight, Bernadette said. Sudden, unexplained, the kind of tragedy that happened more often in those days than anyone likes to admit, and rarely got questioned very hard by grieving 19-year-olds with no money for a lawyer and no family willing to fight on their behalf. I signed paperwork that week I've regretted for 30 years. I was young myself, new to the floor, and the hospital administrator at the time made it very clear that certain arrangements were simply not mine to question. What arrangements? I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. There was a private adoption, Bernadette said, facilitated quietly, outside the normal channels, paid for generously by a family that wanted a baby and had the resources to make sure nobody asked too many questions about how they got one. I never knew the family's name. I wasn't meant to, but I remember the exact date that baby was born because it's the same date you just told me, and I remember what the birth mother looked like well enough that I've spent 51 years occasionally seeing her face on strangers in grocery stores and hospital hallways, and being wrong every single time until 3 nights ago. I sat in that diner booth for a long time before I could make myself ask the next question. Are you telling me my birth mother didn't die? I finally said. You're telling me she was told I died, and I was actually given away. I'm telling you, I think that's exactly what happened, Bernadette said. I've carried it for 30 years without any way to prove it or fix it. I'm 74 years old, Helen. I retire in 4 months. I wasn't going to say anything to you in that hallway. It came out before I could stop it because for 1 second your face looked exactly like a woman I watched cry for 2 straight days over a baby everyone told her was gone. I want to be honest about the state I was in walking out of that diner. It wasn't grief, not yet, and it wasn't quite anger either. It was something closer to vertigo. The specific disorientation of having an entire foundational story about your own life quietly pulled out from underneath you in the space of one conversation. I didn't tell my parents right away. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't only caution, though caution was certainly part of it. For the first time in 51 years, I had a thread that was entirely mine to pull. Something my family couldn't smooth over with another version of the story they'd already decided on decades earlier. I wasn't ready to hand it to them until I understood exactly what I was holding. I hired a genealogist named Priya Anand, No relation to any of the family lawyers this town seems to keep producing, who specialized in exactly this kind of adoption record reconstruction. And together we began pulling at the thread Bernadette had handed me. Birth records from that era, Priya explained, were notoriously incomplete for private adoptions of the kind Bernadette described. Often deliberately so, but incomplete didn't mean impossible. These cases usually leave some kind of trail, Priya told me during our first meeting, spreading a legal pad across her desk, covered in the kind of careful, methodical notes I would come to recognize as her signature working style. Hospitals in that era weren't as digitized, which sounds like it should make things harder and sometimes does, but paper trails are also harder to fully erase than people assume. Someone always signed something. Our job is figuring out whose name that was. She started with hospital staffing records from that period, cross-referencing them against Bernadette's account of who else had been working the floor that week. And within the first 2 weeks, she'd already identified the hospital administrator on duty during that exact window, a man named Harold Grissom, whose name she noted appeared with unusual frequency on private adoption paperwork throughout that entire decade, far more frequently than his official job description would have suggested was appropriate. It took 6 weeks to locate a death certificate filed under the name Doyle for an infant born on October the 14th, and another 2 weeks after that for Priya to notice something that made her go very quiet on our phone call. The death certificate listed a cause of death, sudden infant respiratory failure, but no attending physician's signature, no hospital case number matching any of St. Augustine's actual record-keeping conventions from that period, and a filing date 3 days after the supposed death, an unusual delay that Priya said in her professional experience was a common signature of records that had been fabricated rather than genuinely processed. This wasn't a real death certificate, Priya told me, or if it was based on a real form, it was falsified in ways that would have required someone inside the hospital's administration to sign off on it. Whoever arranged this adoption didn't just pay a family to look the other way. They paid someone to manufacture an entire paper trail, convincing enough that a grieving 19-year-old would never think to question it. I asked Priya during that same call how often she'd seen cases like this in her career. She was quiet for a moment before answering. More than you'd think, and probably far fewer than actually happened, she said. The ones I find are the ones where somebody eventually asked the right question. I think about the ones where nobody ever did, more than I probably should. I found Rosemary Doyle 3 weeks later, living 2 hours away, 70 years old now, widowed, still using her maiden name because, as I would learn, she'd never married, never had another child, spent 5 decades believing she'd lost her only daughter 3 days after giving birth to her. I didn't call her directly. Priya insisted, and I agreed, that this particular truth deserved to arrive in person rather than over the phone. And so I drove to the small house Rosemary had lived in for over 30 years, sat in my car outside it for almost 20 minutes, gathering whatever courage this required, and finally walked up to a front door that, once it opened, showed me a face that Bernadette had been right to recognize in a hospital hallway 51 years later. "Can I help you?" Rosemary said, and I understood standing there that I had exactly 1 sentence to figure out how to say the thing I'd come to say. "My name is Helen," I said. "I think I might be your daughter. I think someone told you I died, and I don't believe that's actually true." Rosemary didn't faint, didn't cry immediately, didn't do any of the things I'd half imagined she might. she simply stood in that doorway for a long moment, studying my face with the exact same unsettling intensity Bernadette had shown me in that hospital hallway. And then she said very quietly, "I've been waiting 51 years for someone to knock on this door and say exactly that sentence. I just never actually believed it would happen." We talked for 6 hours that first afternoon, and in the weeks that followed, a DNA test confirmed formally what both of us, by that point, had no real doubt about already. Rosemary told me about the 2 days she spent holding me in that hospital room, about a nurse whose name she never learned, who'd been kind to her in a way almost nobody else that week had been, about the specific physical grief of being told your baby died and having absolutely no resources, no family support, and no legal standing to question the story you were given. "I named you Margaret," she told me that first afternoon. "For 2 days, you were Margaret. I don't expect that to mean anything to you now. I just wanted you to know there was a name before Helen. There was a whole 2 days that belonged to both of us before anyone decided otherwise." She told me, too, about the years that followed, how she'd moved twice trying to outrun a grief that never actually stayed behind wherever she left it, how she'd been engaged once in her 30s to a man who eventually left because, in his words, she grieved a baby more than she loved anyone still living. A sentence she said had taken her years to stop believing was probably true. She'd never had another child, not out of any medical inability, but because some part of her, she admitted quietly over her third cup of tea that first afternoon, had never quite been able to trust that a second child wouldn't somehow also be taken from her by people with more power than she had. "I used to drive past St. Augustine sometimes," she told me, years after, "and imagine you'd have been starting kindergarten that year, then middle school, then driving a car of your own. I built an entire imaginary life for a daughter I thought was buried 2 counties over, in a grave I visited exactly once and never went back to, because I couldn't stand the specific kind of quiet that cemetery had." She paused, studying my face the way she had in that doorway. "I'm going to need some time to figure out how to feel about the fact that you were never actually in that grave at all. I hope that doesn't sound ungrateful. I don't think I have a word yet for what it actually is." I told her I didn't need her to have a word for it yet, that I was still finding my own words too, and something about saying that out loud, together in her small kitchen, felt like the first genuinely honest conversation either of us had been allowed to have about any of it in 51 years. I hired an attorney, Marcus Webb, who specialized in historical adoption fraud, and together we confirmed, through hospital administrative records Priya had already flagged as suspicious, that the private adoption arrangement facilitating my placement with the Whitfields had indeed been processed outside normal channels, financed through a payment that hospital records cross-referenced years later during an unrelated licensing review had once flagged internally as irregular before the note was apparently buried and never followed up on. Marcus walked me through what our options actually were, carefully over 2 long meetings in his office. "There's no criminal case left to bring," he told me plainly. "Grissom's been dead 15 years, and even if he weren't, the statute of limitations on most of what he likely did ran out decades ago. What we can do is get the record corrected formally, permanently, in a way that matters both legally and, I suspect, emotionally for your birth mother especially. Sometimes the paperwork is the only apology anyone is ever going to get. And I've learned not to underestimate how much that particular kind of apology can still mean, even 50 years late." The hospital administrator responsible, a man named Harold Grissom, had died 15 years earlier, which meant, as with so many of these cases, no criminal proceeding would ever directly hold him accountable. But Marcus explained that the falsified death certificate itself remained a live legal matter. Once the State Vital Records Office had a formal process for correcting once sufficient evidence was presented, and that correction, however symbolic it might have felt at first, mattered enormously to Rosemary in ways I hadn't fully anticipated until I watched her read the amended certificate for the first time. Her daughter's death quietly, formally, officially undone on paper 51 years after it was falsely recorded. She held that single piece of paper in both hands at her kitchen table for almost 10 minutes without speaking. And when she finally looked up at me, she said only, "I kept a copy of the original for 51 years, in case I ever needed to prove to myself it had really happened. I think I can finally throw it away now." I finally told my parents everything on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in the same living room where I'd grown up hearing the version of my adoption story they'd repeated for 5 decades. My father, still recovering slowly from the stroke, listened without saying much, his hand finding mine partway through and staying there. My mother's reaction was the one I'd been bracing for. "We were told the arrangement was legitimate," Diane said, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood. The particular tone she used whenever a conversation threatened to move somewhere she didn't want it to go. "We paid a fair fee through a family friend who assured us everything was handled properly. We didn't know anything about a falsified certificate, Helen. You have to believe that." "I might believe that," I said, "but I also remember Cousin Patricia telling me I was lucky you'd taken me in from wherever I probably would have ended up otherwise." I think some part of this family always understood there was something underneath the official story, even if nobody wanted to look at it directly. I remember asking about the adoption paperwork when I was 17, and you told me it was lost in a basement flood. Every other document in that basement survived just fine. Diane's face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling into something smaller than the defensiveness she'd started with. "I didn't want you looking for anyone," she finally admitted quietly. "Not because I thought there was something illegal behind it. I told myself it was because the past didn't matter. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was always afraid that if you ever met her, you'd realize we weren't actually your first choice of family, just the one that happened to have enough money to make the paperwork disappear." "Nobody's first choice gets to choose anything about how they're born, Mom," I said. "That was never a competition you needed to worry about winning." My mother didn't have a full answer for that, and for the first time in my life, I let her silence sit there without rushing to fill it for her, the way I'd spent 5 decades filling every uncomfortable silence in that family, trying to make my own existence feel less complicated for everyone else's comfort. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, not that afternoon, and honestly not for many months afterward. But it was, I think, the first entirely honest conversation the two of us had ever had. And something about its honesty mattered more to both of us than either of us expected going into it. Rosemary and I built a relationship slowly, carefully, over the following year. Neither of us pretending we could simply recover 51 lost years. Both of us surprised, again and again, by how much easier the rebuilding turned out to be than either of us had braced for. She met my father eventually, once he'd recovered enough for visitors outside the immediate family, and the two of them sat together for an entire afternoon, while I hovered nearby, unsure what to expect, watching two people who had both, in entirely different ways, spent decades loving the same person. Under circumstances neither of them had fully chosen. Bernadette retired 4 months after our first conversation, exactly as she told me she would, and I attended a small gathering the nursing staff held for her, standing quietly near the back until she noticed me and pulled me aside. I almost didn't say anything to you that first night, she told me. 30 years of training myself to keep my mouth shut about things I wasn't supposed to know almost won out one more time. I'm glad it didn't for once. You gave me back 51 years I didn't know I was missing. I told her, I don't think there's a version of thank you big enough for that. She waved that off, the way people who've spent entire careers quietly absorbing other people's gratitude tend to, though I noticed her eyes had gone glassy before she turned to greet another well-wisher. I brought Rosemary to that same retirement gathering, and the two of them sat together in a corner of the hospital break room for nearly an hour. Two women who had been connected for 51 years by a single terrible lie and a single act of unexpected honesty, finally getting to simply talk to each other as themselves rather than as the roles a hallway and a hospital bed had assigned them decades earlier. I think about that hallway often now, the specific ordinary Tuesday night that could have gone entirely differently if Bernadette had simply kept walking, if exhaustion hadn't loosened something in her that 30 years of professional caution had otherwise kept carefully sealed. I think about how close an entire lifetime's worth of truth came to staying buried forever, dependent on nothing more dramatic than one tired nurse's face recognizing another face in a hallway at 11 o'clock at night. I still visit that same hospital regularly now, not for my father anymore. He's stable, recovering well, walking with a cane and complaining about it exactly as much as you'd expect. But for Rosemary, whose own health has begun the slow, ordinary decline that comes with being 70 years old, and every time I walk down that third-floor hallway, I think about the version of me that almost never learned any of this, who would have simply finished her coffee, driven home, and let an entire hidden history stay exactly where someone else had decided 5 decades earlier that it belonged. Diane and I are still finding our way back to each other, slowly, in the particular careful way you rebuild something after learning it was never quite as solid as you believed. She's met Rosemary twice now, both times briefly, both times more graciously than I expected. And though I don't think the two of them will ever be close, I've stopped needing them to be. The same way I've stopped needing any single version of my own story to be the only true one. If this story stays with you, I hope it reminds you that the people who quietly carry the truth for us, nurses, clerks, strangers who happen to remember one detail nobody else bothered to hold on to, deserve more patience and more listening than we usually give them in passing. And if you've ever had a stranger say something to you that changed everything, tell us about it below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the most important sentence anyone will ever say to you arrives by accident, in a hallway at 11 o'clock at night, from someone who almost didn't say it at all.